Hey everybody, welcome back to my Slavic Saturday series where we talk about Slavic history, mythology, and folklore. My name is Brendan Noble, author of the Frostmarked Chronicles, which is my fantasy series based on Slavic mythology. This week, we're going a bit different when it comes to Slavic Saturday because we're going back to talk about a story specifically from folklore. A few months ago, I talked about the Polish fairy tale The Bear in the Forest Hut, and this week I'm talking about another Polish fairy tale which is Carried Away by the Wind. But before I jump too far into this story, I just wanted to remind you that for the first book in the Frostmarked Chronicles, which is called A Dagger in the Winds, I am looking for advanced readers who are people to receive a free copy in the book early in exchange for a review either on Amazon or your favorite retailer. Head over to the links down in the description below for more information on that. But now let's dive into the story. So this story comes from a collection by John Theophilus Nike. I might be pronouncing that name wrong, the spelling will be down below. But this story is coming from a collection of tales throughout time, and in this version, which I'll be reading today and then talking about a little bit in the end, just kind of going about some connections between this folk tale and the connection to other fairy tales, as well as just Slavic mythology and folklore in general, what kind of themes come across. And Carried Away by the Wind specifically is about a peasant who has angered a wizard or magician and kind of gotten himself into some trouble. And that is where our story begins. A certain magician, being angry with a young peasant, came to the hut where he lived and struck a new sharp knife under the threshold, repeating an incantation as he did so, accompanied by this wish: "May this peasant be seized and carried away by the wind into the air, there to be remain for 7 whole years." The peasant went into the fields to make hay, when all of a sudden a great wind arose. It scattered the hay over the field, and seized the peasant himself. In vain he struggled, in vain he caught hold with the strong arms of hedge or branch of tree. The invisible power lifted him up and carried him away. Borne as if on wings of the wind, among the clouds he flew like a wild pigeon. The sun began already to disappear in the west, and the hungry peasant could see the smoke ascending from the cottages in his village, where supper was cooking. At one time he could almost touch the chimney pots with his feet, and he screamed aloud for help. But he screamed and wept in vain. No one heard his cries, or saw his bitter tears. He was thus carried about in the air for nearly 3 months, and by that time, from hunger and thirst, he had become dried up like a piece of wood. He traveled over large parts of the world, but the wind carried him chiefly over the village where he had lived. With tears in his eyes, he would look on the hut where dwelt his betrothed. He would see her coming out with dinner for someone of the family. He would spread his thin, cold arms towards her and call her by name. His voice would die in his throat, while the girl would not even look up. Away and away the peasant was borne by the wind. Presently he saw the cruel magician standing before his own house. The magician looked up and shouted to him, "Ah, I have not done with you yet. You shall be thus carried by the wind over your village for 7 long years. You shall suffer constantly, and wish you were dead, but you shall not be able to die." "Oh, my little father, my master, forgive me if I've offended you," cried the poor fellow from above. "Look at me, see, my mouth is as dry as a chip. Look at my face and hands, the flesh is gone from them, and the bones only are left. Have mercy upon me." The magician whispered a few words, and the peasant stopped in his circular motion, and remained still in the air. "It is all very well to ask my pardon, but what will you promise to give me if I let you down?" "All that you ask for," cried the poor peasant, and he put his hands together as in supplication, and knelt down in the air. "Will you give me your sweetheart?" demanded the magician. "I want her for my wife. If you will promise to give her to me, I will let you come down once more to the earth." The peasant was silent for a moment. Thought he to himself, "When I am once more on the ground, I'll see what can be done." He therefore called out to the magician, "O master, you ask a great sacrifice from me, but it cannot be otherwise. Let it be as you will." Hereupon the magician blew upon him, and he came down to the ground. Oh, how happy he was when he felt that he could walk, and the wind had no more power over him. He hastened home. Before the door he met his betrothed. At the sight of her long-lost lover, over whose fate she had often wept, the astonished girl cried out with surprise. The peasant pushed her gently aside and went into the house. There he saw the farmer who employed him, and said to him with tears in his eyes, "I can no longer serve you, nor can I marry your daughter. I love her as dearly as my sight, but she can never be mine." The countryman looked at him in wonder, and seeing how sorrowful was his thin, pale face, formerly so fat and rosy, he asked the reason why he refused to marry his daughter. The peasant told him all, his journey in the air and the promise he had made the magician. The farmer, having heard him out, bade the poor fellow to be of good cheer. Then he took a purse full of money and went to a witch for advice. When he returned in the evening, he was smiling and happy, and said to the peasant, "Go tomorrow before daylight to the witch, and all will be right." The peasant, weary as he was, went to bed and soon fell fast asleep. He got up, however, before daylight and went to the witch. He found her, crouching before a fire, burning herbs. The witch told him to stand quietly by. The morning was calm and beautiful, but suddenly a strong wind arose and made the hut tremble. Then the witch took the peasant into the yard and told him to look up. He raised his eyes and saw the wicked magician, with nothing on but his nightshirt, whirling around and round in the air. "There is your enemy," said the witch. "He will hunt you no more. If you wish him to see your wedding, do as I will tell you. For the rest, he will suffer the same punishment as he had designed for you." The delighted peasant ran back home. In a month's time he was married. When the guests were dancing at his wedding, the peasant went out into the yard, looked up, and saw above the hut the magician spinning round and round in the air. He took a new knife, and aiming at the magician, threw it with all his might. The magician fell down, and then it was seen that he was nailed by foot to the ground. Thus he was obliged to stand by the window, a miserable witness to the happiness of the peasant and his friends. On the following morning the magician had disappeared before the hut. Some people say they saw him flying through the air over a large lake some miles off. Before and behind him were large flocks of crows, which by their croaking told of his continued flight through space. So when it comes to stories in general and folk tales, especially Slavic ones, can often have a negative twist to them. So overall, this is a more positive one, in my view at very least. The story of the man who was going to spend 7 years floating around, having nothing to eat or drink in the winds, was able to come down and be able to marry the woman he loved. And there's some themes that go along with many other stories that appear throughout Slavic folklore and mythology. And some of the most prevalent ones are just the fact, first of all, of wizards and witches and magicians and how these things play a role in Slavic folklore. And so part of this comes into one of the most famous stories from Slavic folklore, and that is Koshchei the Deathless. In his story, we hear Koshchei himself is a evil sorcerer who captures Ivan's wife and runs off with her. But then in the story as well, there are positive wizards that help Ivan on his tail when he tries to save his wife, as well as the evil witch, Baba Yaga, who is also one of the most famous people from Slavic mythology, and how she attempts to also stop Ivan from capturing the horse that he needs to be able to catch Koshchei. And so it's kind of interesting, this role that wizards, witches, and everything play in Slavic folklore and mythology. It also plays in the story of Vasilisa the Beautiful, the Bear in the Forest Hut, and many others, where we have these characters that witchcraft can be positive or negative depending on the context and who is applying it. The morality sometimes is a little gray depending on what point of view comes across, but often the idea of humility, goodwill, and things like this come across positively when it comes to sorcery. And in this story, we see that the peasant is a very loving man and was trying to be honest and bring back the promise that he had offered the magician. But it was the father's goodwill seeing this man that he went to the witch, and she selfishly, because she got paid, used her sorcery to stop the magician from doing evil things, and he got his punishment. So magic in this story is kind of seen as a punishment, which is interesting as well. Another small detail that you may have noticed is the prevalence of a knife 2 of the times that sorcery is used. First, when the magician first casts the spell against the peasant, we have a knife appear in which he drives it into the threshold. Knives were a common usage of different types of things in folklore. It was thought, for example, in my Vilkulak video I talked about, where knives were often needed for sorcerers to theoretically transform into different shapes. And in this case, it seems that the knife was needed as well for him to cast the mark against the peasant. And often thresholds as well hold some type of element of power, so perhaps him walking through the threshold caused this thing to befall him after the magician cast the spell. The knife then appears again almost in a revenge roundaboutism at the end, where the peasant throws it and impales the magician's foot into the ground. And this is also a kind of interesting thing. He's not necessarily using magic here, but there's a strong symbolism in this aspect of everything the magician does selfishly or harshly comes back to haunt him, which is a lesson I believe is being taught in this folktale. So part of the lessons potentially in this folktale are that lesson of if you're using your magic or your power or whatever it is harshly upon someone, that it can come back to haunt you in your own way. And there's this idea of, I don't know if it's a morality aspect or just the idea of if you're doing something wrong, often the same can be done to you in the exact opposite way, which happened in this case. There's also, I believe, just a positive aspect of goodwill upon the father's part to help his future son-in-law. Kind of like the idea that occurs in The Bear in the Forest Hut, where the girl in that story helps the mouse and the mouse then helps her in return. Perhaps this peasant has the good relationship because of his love for the daughter that then allows the father to help him in return. And so this idea of good turns are often returned as well. But that's all I have necessarily to talk about with this story. If you have any thoughts about this story, I would love to hear about it in the comments down below. I'm always interested to hear what people think about different folklore stories. But until next week, I look forward to hearing what your thoughts are, and as well as if you have any ideas about things you would like to hear on this series, be sure to comment them down below as well. I'm always looking for different things to talk about. There's a lot in Slavic mythology and folklore, so sometimes it can move some things up my list with what you guys want to hear. But I look forward to seeing you guys next week.